All right, colleagues, I think I'll get us slowly, bit by bit underway here. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll go into panelist mode. There we are. Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. I'm Diana MacKay from Aga Khan University. I am the special advisor to the Provost and global practice lead for the university's new Brain and Mind Institute. I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the decriminalization of suicide in Kenya, hosted by the Brain and Mind Institute at Aga Khan University. So I'm going to get us started with a few housekeeping notes. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available in a few days' time on AKU's website. And as we get underway, I'll post the links to where you can access that recording. We have had, I think, well over 200, nearly 300, perhaps we've broken through the 300 mark for registrations for the webinar today. And really terrific collection of stakeholders in the topic joining us. I'd like to invite all of you to connect with each other during the course of the webinar today. So to do that, we've enabled the Zoom features that facilitate your engagement. First and most usefully, we've turned on the chat function. So I encourage you to introduce yourselves by name and organization, any other brief information that you think would be useful to share with those that are with us today, including your contact information if you'd like to be networking with each other. And please note that when you use the chat feature, there's a drop-down menu that allows you to send your comments either to all panelists or to all panelists and attendees. So please do share your comments with all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your contributions. And feel free to engage in the chat during the course of the webinar. Second, we have also turned on the Q&A function to allow you to pose questions that we can address during the course of the webinar. We have a brief period for a moderated discussion, so we hope to engage with your questions at that point. And finally, if you're interested, I invite you to communicate with us all by email, and I will certainly be posting my email address in the chat, and I will encourage all those of you who are interested in connecting by email to do the same. I'll run very quickly through the format for today's webinar. I'm going to introduce in a moment Dr. Lukoye Atwoli, who is going to kick us off. He's our Dean of our Medical College in East Africa, and more about him in a moment. And then we're going to have an overview of the global picture for suicide and legal status by Dr. Murad Khan, followed by some presentations by Dr. Linet Ongeri, Dr. Simon Njuguna, and Dr. Boniface Chitayi. And we'll have a few additional individuals joining us to share their perspectives on the issues, Ms. Charity Muturi and Mr. Victor Kamau, followed by Dr. Frank Njenga, and he will offer some summary comments. And finally, I'll ask my colleague at the Brain and Mind Institute, Dr. Merali, to present his vision for the Institute's work going forward. So we've got a lot of people to go through the webinar to share their views today, and we'll do our best to keep on time. So bear with me as I sort of encourage everybody to keep on track. To keep our introductions brief, I will also be posting longer bios for everybody in the chat as we proceed. But let me begin simply by saying that Dr. Lukoye Atwoli, who I'm going to call on next, is Professor of Psychiatry and the Dean of AKU's Medical College East Africa. He's well known to many of you already for his research. Perhaps some of you have been fortunate to have him as an instructor, teacher, professor, and we can all keep up with his activities on social media, where his voice carries considerable influence. I will post more about Dr. Lukoye in a moment, but first, now to you for your opening comments and to set the stage for us, please, Dean Atwoli, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you everybody who has made time this afternoon to join us for this important discussion. I'll begin by just reading out a statement in our laws, that is section 226 of the penal code in the country, states that any person who attempts to kill himself is guilty of a misdemeanor. And that has stayed in our statute books for many years, since the days of the colonial rule. And we inherited this statute, and it continues to be operational to this day. Its implementation varies, but as long as it remains in the statute books, it creates a considerable barrier to care seeking by people who need that kind of care. And this is the genesis of the kind of conversation that we are going to have today. Before Section 226, there is Section 225 of the Penal Code, which also deals with aiding and abetting suicide in the same manner as aiding and abetting a crime, rather than considering it as something else. And all this will be part of the kind of conversation that we'll be having going forward. I consider this section of the law to be a serious indictment on how our society deals with our most vulnerable. As we all know, and as we shall see in today's presentations, suicide attempts are at the tail end for a person who has severe psychological or social distress. It is not a decision anybody takes lightly, and it is sad that we as a society collectively seek to punish a person in that state of turmoil, in that state of distress, instead of providing care for them. I believe it is time for us to start a conversation on providing the help and support that those most vulnerable of our people need, rather than criminalizing their distress or pretending that our society is too strong to suffer from psychological distress. Today's webinar will hopefully start a conversation around suicide, but more broadly also around mental health in our region and in the world in general, because the experts that will be speaking to us are really global experts in the field. And I'm hopeful that today's conversation will also create networks and alliances that will start processes and movements that work together to eventually decriminalize suicide and begin reducing the stigma towards mental ill health across the globe. And finally, I expect that this forum will also, this webinar will create a forum for advocacy across many sectors. As you will see, it is not only a medical or mental health family thing. It is something that cuts across the law, it cuts across society, and we even have a participant today who will speak from a lived experience perspective on how criminalization of suicide impacts on the life of a caregiver and of a person suffering from mental ill health. This webinar has been organized by the Brain and Mind Institute of the Aga Khan University, together with the Medical College East Africa and the Kenya Psychiatric Association, which is very well represented here, as well as the Ministry of Health's Division of Mental Health, as you can see on the list of panelists. The Brain and Mind Institute is a new institute at the Aga Khan University, and its focus is on, as you can well make out, on mental health and neuroscience, advancing conversations around mental health and neuroscience in the areas of education, in the areas of research and innovation, in the areas of advocacy and policy, and in supporting to ensure that we have quality care for our people who have mental ill health and neurological disorders. And finally, I'll just point out that the Aga Khan University is developing a mental health framework that will guide the family within Aga Khan Development Network, but may also find use outside of the network within the countries that we find ourselves in. So I take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this conversation. I look forward to a robust and interesting conversation and outputs that will change the state of mental health in this country. Thank you very much and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Lukoye. And now we'll turn to Professor Murad Khan for an overview of the global context.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this really important webinar. I'm going to give a brief overview of suicide and the legal status of suicide as it exists to set the stage for the following speakers. Suicide is a major global public health problem, and between 800,000 to 1 million deaths happen annually every year around the world. This number of 800,000 has come down from what was previously estimated to be about 1 million deaths annually 5 to 10 years ago. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it continues to happen around the world. It is the 15th leading cause of death worldwide, and one of the worrying things is that it is the second highest cause of death in people who are under the age of 30 years. So young people all across the world are dying by suicide at a much higher rate than in the previous years, and that is worrying, because the younger the person who dies, the more productive years of life that is lost to society and to the community. 75% of all suicides take place in low and middle income countries of Africa, South America, and South Asia. And Asia, being the largest continent, contributes 60% of the suicides. And in fact, two countries, India and China, the two mega countries of more than 1 billion population, contribute 40% of the global suicides. If you look at the different regions of the world according to WHO, then you can see that the highest numbers of suicide or the highest crude rates are in Europe, but then there are variations between the age standardized rates and the crude male and the crude female rate as you look at different regions of the world. In Africa, the crude rate is relatively lower compared to Europe and South Asia, but the age standardized rate is higher, and that is probably an indication of the average age of the population in a society. So South Asia as well as Africa has got a much younger population than the Western Europe countries. All over the world, males outnumber females in suicides, but in individual countries, in some individual countries, the ratio is much narrower. And in countries like Bangladesh and China, rural China, the rates may be actually reversed in the sense that there are more females than males who kill themselves. This is the current map of the world, the current suicide map of the world according to the rates. And you can see that countries with dark brown or the dark orange are the countries with higher rates of suicide, which includes North America, parts of Russia and Australia. And countries which has low rates are countries in light yellow or light orange, which includes many countries of the Middle East, many Islamic countries, and many countries of Africa. What this map does not show is that a large number of countries in the developing world do not either collect national suicide statistics or report to the WHO. So WHO has to come up with estimates, and this map actually reflects the estimates, not the real figures in many of these countries. So one has to be very careful when we look at these kind of maps. Suicide is now one of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal, and by 2030, all NCDs have to reduce premature mortality by 1/3, and so we are expected to reduce suicide mortality across the globe by 1/3. And currently, if you look at the current trends of 2019, by 2019, only 3% of the 118 countries will attain the SDG goal to reduce suicide mortality by 1/3. And this, the reason for that is vast majority of the countries around the world are not investing enough in mental health and suicide prevention. Suicide is an extremely complex phenomena. It is not so simple. It has psychological, biological, personal, social perspectives, and all these factors come together at a certain point in time to make a person suicidal and to get on to what is called the suicidal pathway. And then the person starts progressing on the suicidal pathway until he or she reaches a tipping point. And then depending on the means of suicide, the methods that they use, the timing of the discovery and the quality of the medical services, an attempt when it's made will either be fatal or be non-fatal. So many of the factors play a part in this. And therefore, suicide prevention also has to be multifaceted and multidisciplinary. And so studying suicide must be done in the local socio-cultural, religious, and political factors in which the person lives. The WHO encourages suicide prevention strategy for all countries, and these are some of the elements of a good national suicide prevention strategy, of which the most fundamental is surveillance. Without good, robust, quality data through surveillance, we cannot come up with prevention strategies that are applicable for that setting. So that is fundamental. And one of the things that WHO also shows very clearly in this map is the quality of the data on suicidal behavior, that is attempted suicide, suicidal ideation, and completed suicide is very low. The dark brown is very low in a vast number of countries, and then low in many other countries also. And it is only the developed Western countries that have high quality, reliable data. So you can see that it is not just suicide to be seen in a vacuum, but it is really the societal development that is also reflected in how systems, processes, and surveillance systems are then influenced. So it's a pause for thought that while we focus on suicide prevention or decriminalization, we also need to look at the wider societal development. So coming on to the legal status of suicide, at the beginning of the 19th century, most countries had laws that punished people who made attempts at suicide. But over the last 50 or 60 years, most but not all countries have decriminalized suicide completely. And it continues to be illegal in about 25 countries around the world. And there are additional 10 countries which have Sharia law, and these are all Islamic countries, that also have various types of punishment for people who attempt suicide or who indulge in self-harm. These are the countries where suicide continues to be criminalized. India was probably the last country in which it was decriminalized. At the moment, it is partly decriminalized, although the Supreme Court of India has decriminalized it and said it should be considered as a psychiatric or a mental health issue. It has not been fully implemented. But some of the other countries, and you can see there are some African countries as well as many countries of Asia, continue to criminalize suicide in their statute books. The legal penalties against people who make attempted suicide vary in different settings, from small fines or a warning to short periods of imprisonment to longer imprisonment. And many countries who do have laws and where suicide or suicidal behavior is criminalized do not actually prosecute people. I know in Pakistan, my country, very few people are actually prosecuted according to the law, but we do know the law is used to punish people, to extort money, to exploit people, and in some cases, it is used as a political weapon against the political opponent. So it does create a lot of problems. Now, some of the arguments for decriminalization of suicide or suicidal behavior are these: that you have to have a tolerant and compassionate attitude towards someone who is in a mental health or a suicidal crisis rather than a punitive one. When we decriminalize suicide in a certain society, it improves the measurement of suicidal behavior, the extent and characteristic of suicidal behavior that leads to good quality data on which we can then base our prevention programs. Suicidal behavior should be recognized and treated as a public health issue rather than as a medical legal issue only. And there is a very strong ethical and social justice perspective to that. If, for example, if poverty or unemployment is related to suicidal behavior and the person makes an attempt because of poverty or because he or she is unemployed, then to further punish him or her does not really make sense. So there is a very strong ethical and a social justice issue for decriminalizing suicide. It will reduce stigma and increase health-seeking behavior in people who are suffering from mental health problems. The adverse effects of imprisonment can further add to the person's woes. And in the societies where it is criminalized, there is hidden suicidal behavior. So we really don't know what is the extent of the problem, and people don't come forward and seek help. I know in Pakistan, people who can afford to go to private hospitals where they are given medical treatment, and the ER staff or the medical people there then mislabel them as either accidental poisoning or a medical problem, and so it never comes to the attention of the researchers or the authorities, and it is certainly not counted. And also, some of the arguments are that at the moment, there is obviously a time and resources that are used in registering cases, in doing investigation, and so on. So it will actually free up the authorities, the police, and the other legal authorities to concentrate on other issues and other more important crimes than suicidal behavior. So these are some of the arguments that he used. Some of the counter arguments against decriminalization are these. Some people say to criminalize suicide in a society acts as a deterrent for people to indulge in this behavior, which, if you look at some of the statistics from the countries where it is criminalized, does not hold true. Some people argue that if you remove that, it will increase the suicidal behavior, which is again not true, because decriminalizing does not mean you are legalizing it as you legalize cannabis, for example. But it's very important in advocacy that we make this point that we want to decriminalize. We're not making it legal, or we're not encouraging people to indulge in suicidal behavior. The criminal status recognizes the sanctity of human life, and if you remove that, then you are also, the state is also not recognizing the sanctity of human life. So that's another argument that is used. Some people say that temporary imprisonment actually is protective, because if they are acutely and actively suicidal, imprisoning them will stop them from actually indulging or making a second attempt. Some argue that it may handicap law enforcement, because then people may use suicidal threats to get the demands, and so the police will have to be called in, and because they can't charge these people, then it'll cause problems for them. If you decriminalize suicide, then the state loss of investment in the individual contributes to progress of a society, and it's the state's responsibilities to stop people from killing themselves, and so it's justified to criminalize some act. In countries like India, where sati, or the widow throwing herself on the funeral pyre, is now criminalized activity, but to decriminalize suicidal behavior may encourage that kind of behavior. And in many Islamic countries, they say that if you decriminalize it, then it is really going against the religious edicts, because Islam very strongly condemns suicide as a major sin. However, it is very clear from all the research that has been done, all the reviews that have been done where suicide has been decriminalized, that both the World Health Organization and the International Association for Suicide Prevention, they firmly advocate decriminalizing suicide, because it is extremely important to help the person who is in the throes of a mental health or a suicidal crisis. And it is also one of the important components that hinders national suicide prevention strategy. So there is a need to promote decriminalization of suicide in countries that have laws that treat suicide attempters as criminals. We need to remove that because these are people who need our help for their mental health and related problems. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Murad. Listening to your overview just, I think, provides us all with ample evidence that we are lucky to have you at AKU and on our team here as we proceed with this issue. So thanks very much for your comments. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, in the discussion. I'd like to turn now to Linet, please, Dr. Linet Ongeri, for perspectives on suicide and self-harm in Kenya and some of the research work that you've done. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. The presentation today is going to be on the perspectives of suicide and self-harm in Kenya. And a lot of the information I'll be providing is based on studies that we've just recently conducted as part of my PhD. So it's a subject, the decriminalization of suicide is a subject that is really close to my heart at this point. So my outline, I'll speak about the suicide burden in Kenya, and also now move on to focus a lot more on qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews that we conducted at the coast of Kenya that was trying to explore what drives individuals to contemplate suicide around the coastal region, the cultural meaning of suicide, and also looking at suicide prevention recommendations that the participants actually gave within that area, that could work within that area. So on suicide burden, first I'll start off with the suicide incident. So these are completed suicide or fetal suicidal behaviors, can also be called fetal suicidal behavior. We have two major studies that have been conducted in Kenya. That the first, both of them are based in KEMRI, Kenya Medical Research Institute, HDSS that is a health demographic survey system, whereby we map out certain regions of Kenya and we collect data on disease and mortality, causes of mortality in details, on maybe even a peri-annual basis, on a biannual basis, sorry. Then, for Kilifi, there's a study that was conducted in Kilifi, and this study looked at suicide incidents within that Kilifi HDSS region and found a suicide incidence of 4.61 per 100,000 population. A different study that now recently has been submitted, where I was involved, we found a suicide incidence of 6.7 per 100,000 population. So what's interesting, we decided to move a little bit more and really do more in-depth analysis, what we call content analysis. So in this case, we looked at maybe missing suicide or misreports of suicides or hidden suicides among the accidental deaths. And from that particular analysis, we found an increase from the 6.7 to now 14.7 of probable incidents within that same population. So again, you can see a really big difference. And when you compare with the WHO 2016 estimates for Kenya, it's at 5.6 per 100,000 population. Again, when you compare the 14.7 after doing in-depth content analysis, you see there's such a huge discrepancy. And as Murad has mentioned, there's a lot of underreporting when it comes to suicide because of the fear of the stigma, partly because of the fear of stigma or fear of being, stigmatized because of, being related to suicidality when data is being collected in these particular areas. So the same picture applies, or I'll also speak about the risk factors within these particular studies. The risk factors that were seen, just in keeping with the global data, is mental and neurological and substance use disorders, being male, and poverty were high risk factors for suicide, even in in Kenya. So to do with suicidal behavior, specifically suicidal attempts, there are also a number of studies that have been conducted. I'll focus a lot more on these community samples. There's one study that was conducted around the Kombewa region as well, that is Western Kenya, near Kisumu area, and we found 1.9% of the community population had said in their lifetime they had attempted suicide. And another study that is based around Nandi region, also more or less around the Western Kenya region, found 16.4% of people reporting suicidal lifetime attempts. So again, quite a difference within these two particular studies. For when you're looking at suicidal attempts, the risk factors that came out strongly were, again, having a mental, neurological, or substance use disorder, being female, and also having a chronic illness. That tend to increase the risk of someone mentioning that they had attempted suicide in their lifetime. So to be able to get, just as Murad had mentioned, there are a lot of variations in terms of risk factors from one community, from one region to another. The legal considerations, some countries have suicide as a criminal offense, and other suicidal behavior as a criminal offense, and others do not. So it's important to be able to carry out in-depth, contextualized kind of studies within particular settings so that it can be able to inform suicide prevention intervention, to be able to have maybe a more contextualized and culturally responsive suicide prevention intervention. So we did do in-depth interview study, whereby we asked participants, still in the same coastal region, we asked participants about what are some of the reasons or triggers that someone would end up reason for a suicidal act. And again, similar to what we found in the surveys earlier, is the mention of the mental, neurological, and substance use disorders was really highlighted. The other thing is interpersonal problems, specifically interpersonal conflicts, violence, breakups, affairs. Those ones were mentioned again and again, especially among the youth or the younger population. And financial reasons also. Land is a very emotive issue at the coast region. So issues to do with land disputes, job loss, or debt were some of the reasons that were mentioned, and also chronic illnesses like HIV and cancer, especially if they're linked to pain they mentioned that these are some of the drivers of suicide within that particular region. So we went on to try and understand and explore how is suicide really conceptualized in this particular population. And what was interesting in the interviews is that they kept, as much as the reasons for suicide would be, mainstream things like the mental and neurological problems and things like financial reasons, there was this supernatural attribution to suicide that kept coming up. Many would say they attribute suicide to witchcraft or spiritual possession or inherited curses. Especially the inherited curses came about, especially in families whereby you have like a familial trend of persons dying of suicide within that particular family. And this supernatural attribution also did have some impact. We saw when it comes to the burial practices of the suicide victim. For example, when it comes to how the treatment of suicidal individuals, or even the treatment of how the bereaved family members were treated. And it also had an impact on the care-seeking behavior of people who were seeking care for suicidal behavior. So I'll maybe just highlight on one quote that was given by a healthcare worker. He said, they will always associate it with witchcraft. They will say majini were thrown to him or her, so that you don't consider yourself worth, you feel you're worthless, you're hopeless, there's no reason for you to live, so that you hang yourself and die. Again, bringing out that aspect of overall there's some spiritual connection to why someone would end up taking their lives, but then there's still this aspect of now that is what causes the mental health problems, where someone feels depressed and ends up in that particular state. So we further explored how did people conceptualize the suicidal act itself? What did they think of the suicidal act itself? And how did people in that region think of the suicidal act itself? And some of the descriptors, again, and quite negative descriptors, to explain what the suicidal act was perceived as taboo, as illegal, as shameful, evil, a bad omen, or a curse. And also we asked about how is someone who is suicidal perceived in this particular community. And so again, the descriptors were around this person tend to be perceived as weak, cursed, burdensome, an outcast, crazy, or even bewitched. So these are some of the, again, very stigma-related kind of perspectives that were coming out in the interviews when we talked to participants within that community. And then we also explored legal perspectives, and many were aware that suicidal attempt was in a criminal offense, and there was divided opinion on how beneficial the law is. And what was interesting when we talked to people in the judicial system, for example, this magistrate, he commented that, if you look at the law, the punishment for even attempting to commit suicide is very harsh. But as I've told you, rarely do judicial officers employ that penalty, because for us, this is not a criminal, it's more of a mental issue. So just what Murad was trying to explain, that it's maybe they don't really implement it. A lot of the time they're not implementing it because they do recognize that it is a mental issue. Then for this particular law, interestingly enough, this quote came from a clinical officer, a healthcare worker, and they said, that's okay, because that person who attempted suicide will attempt it again if left free. It's better they be kept in police custody for them to know that the country and the world needs them. Again, emphasizing on that thing, like maybe it's more of a deterrent, not really a criminal thing, but it might keep them somewhere safe for some time before releasing them, so that they don't attempt it again. So the opinion was really divided on how beneficial that law is. The other thing that we explored was the care-seeking behavior of persons who are suicidal, and we found a very convoluted pathway to care with a lot of delayed healthcare seeking. And as this has already even been elaborated, I think it's more of a global picture that the healthcare workers that were interviewed kept saying that most of the people would actually come, or we'd actually meet them at the point of emergency care. When emergency care was needed, when someone has attempted suicide, that's when they'll be connected or linked to healthcare services. And because of the fact that currently suicide is criminal offense, most of them would prefer going to a private facility. Of course, this is what they would prefer, it may not be something that is possible because of finances. And they do this to try and avoid getting arrested. Again, just clearly showing how the criminal nature of this law has a really big impact in terms of care-seeking behavior. And based on back on what they were talking about, it being attributed to some, spiritual aspect, we asked them like how their care was, and most of them would talk about, first of all, the linkages go with to religious leaders or to traditional healers. Those are the people who tend to be the first contact of care for people who are feeling suicidal at any point. And then usually the care provided at this point is prayers, and for in the case of traditional healers, a lot of rituals are also offered for suicidal individuals. Just as an example, there's a person who had attempted suicide that we interviewed, and they said, so when my mother saw me trying to hang myself, she asked me why I was doing that, and she said, it's better they take me to church so that I'm prayed for. So she took me to the church and was prayed for, and that feeling ended. So again, that first contact of care ends up being at the church or the religious organization. Another one said, yes, and in our place, we usually consult the witch doctors, but me, I'm refused to go to them because I'm Christian. And when you go to church, you're told that if you fast and pray, God will help you out of all your troubles. Again, just emphasizing this care-seeking behavior of people in this community. And it's important to really understand what's going on here, so that when we are thinking of interventions, we try and contextualize for that particular region what is going on. So we asked them what are suicide prevention strategies that, what recommendations can they make in terms of suicide prevention strategies in that region? And a lot of them were focused around stigma reduction. They thought maybe decriminalizing the law would help them increase access to care and just reduce the stigma in the first place, so they're able to even verbalize what they're going through. Others talked about sensitization on mental illnesses, because mental illness in itself is already stigmatized. The other thing was around increasing access to care. Many talked about training gatekeepers, and this included even the religious leaders, the clergy that we interviewed. They wanted some bit of training to know what to do to support persons who needed this kind of care. They talked about increasing access to trained counselors, training frontline healthcare workers, improving access to drug rehabilitation services within that place, and also providing, especially the youth, talked about providing youth-friendly safe spaces, because they felt like they could really not fit in going to mental, healthcare services, and that just the fact that it's so stigmatized, we're not able to really access those places. So the youth who are interviewed really talked about providing youth-friendly safe spaces. So in summary, there is a high burden of suicidal behavior in Kenya. And the stigma and one of the things that we kept seeing is the stigma of suicide really stems from this aspect of criminalization, and also the cultural beliefs contributes to a lot of underreporting. As much as we think maybe it's 5.6 based on the WHO estimates, there is really a lot of underreporting, and we might be really not getting the accurate data and not being able to actually put in measures that can be able to reduce suicide. So there is a need to increase the awareness on suicide, and to also increase a lot more on what the risk factors is, let people understand what they are, what suicide is all about. There's a need to train gatekeepers on supportive care, and also to be able to refer persons who need care. And honestly, an open conversation on increasing access to care and also on accurate data capture can only happen successfully once we've decriminalized, because people are really scared of opening up and saying, maybe my loved one died of suicide, or I'm going through this particular thing. So there's a need to decriminalize suicide so that people can seek care, and also that we're able to get accurate data to be able to put in good suicide prevention measures in future. So I'll finish with this quote that a magistrate, again, I found it very interesting. This is a judicial officer who said, but once you've reached that stage of committing suicide, I don't think there's much the law can do. I would not advocate a situation where we enhance the sentencing, because to me, that is not a solution. Because even now, if you want to commit suicide because of one aspect or the other, and I take you to prison, won't you look for a belt and hang yourself? I found this really powerful because, again, the judicial system is, quote unquote, what people who are supposed to be, enforcing all this, laws, but I mean, even them, they've really seen this. This is someone who really needs help and should not be put within the legal system. So thank you so much. These are my references and my supervisors and my research assistants for the study, the PhD work that I'm currently conducting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Linet. That's a terrific overview of your research, and it's clear that the depth of this research is going to be very valuable as we move forward with a difficult topic at hand. Let's turn now to Dr. Simon Njuguna from the Ministry of Health in Kenya to give an overview of suicide prevention policy. Simon?
So thank you, Diana. I hope you can share my slides.
Yes, I can. Just a moment.
So I will start by thanking the organizers of this webinar. I think it has come at the right time. Basically, as you're saying, the topic for today is on the decriminalization of suicide in Kenya. And we are trying to have a dialogue on the rationale and the context for this change. And from the Ministry of Health perspective, we working on policies to try and see we address this. As you are aware, mental health is at forefront of our policies and our actions. We recently launched the Task Force on Mental Health report, and one of the key recommendations from that task force was we need to decriminalize suicide. So I'll just give an overview of suicide prevention policy in Kenya. And basically, my presentation will be to take you through the key pillars in terms of policies. I would like to say the Ministry of Health and the stakeholders is currently working on a suicide prevention strategy, which will be looking at our key strategic pillars and actions for the next 5 years. These will be part and parcel of implementation of the Kenya Mental Health Policy and the Task Force report on mental health. As you have seen from my previous speakers, from the WHO estimate in 2016, the age standardized suicide mortality rate in Kenya was found as 5.6. But again, you saw from another slide, we are within the countries which they are reporting on suicide attempts and other suicide behavior. The data is not up to date. Again, you have seen from the various studies which have been done, there is quite wide variations of the data we are getting. And so this will be an important step as we work on our policy. So let me go specifically to the policy. We'll be looking at these 5 areas. These will be our key areas of action, or strategic action when it comes to the suicide prevention strategy. But before I go specific to these 5 areas, I would like to mention, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, suicide or suicidal behavior is a very complex issue, which has, when we look at the associated risk factors, they tend to stem from very wide areas. You may see some risk factors which you may tend to consider at a systemic and societal level. And these will look at the various determinants of health and also other determinants of the whole aspect of life within a society. As we have seen from some of the associated risk factors, we have seen issues of poverty. We have seen how religion plays in terms, sometimes maybe as a risk factor, sometimes as a protective factor. There are other factors which are at a community and family relationship levels. The other factors you may consider at an individual level. We have seen the association with mental, neurological, and substance use conditions. So when we come up to working on policies, we need to look at these big perspectives, that these are multifaceted conditions with associated and major risk factors and determinants. And so our policy may go beyond health. So we have policies touching on various aspects of our society in terms of issues of poverty eradication, issues about employment. We look at the health policies, and all these policies may address some of these multifaceted components which in a complex way lead to suicidal behavior. So when we work on the policies, some of the key policies apart from the health policies, we'll be looking at the pesticide control policy. Because as you see, one of the means of suicide, especially in our region, is the use of organophosphate or other pesticides. That is a very key policy. We need to look at the policies which addresses the use of prescription drugs. Again, there's a lot of prescription drugs within our country, and many people access them as a means of suicidal attempt. We need to look at the policies on issues of the ICT, especially now that there is a lot of conversation within the social media, which has been shown to have some contributing factors to various suicidal behavior. So the access, the use, the content within our ICT or digital framework, that will be very important. So in general, these are some of the policies. So it means the policies will go beyond health. There will be policies at the agriculture ministry. There will be policies at the Pharmacy and Poisons Control Authority. There will be policies within issues of ICT. We also need policies around the use of firearms, because that's one of the means very common used. We need also policies around built environment and how we develop various infrastructures, whether they are civil infrastructure or any other infrastructure. So policies, as we'll be able to demonstrate in our action plan or our strategy, will touch on various sectors. Then let me mention about the legal framework. The legal framework, currently we need to decriminalize suicide. There is a lot of evidence which support that we don't need that section of the law. It causes more harm than any benefits. So according to the legal framework, that is something we'll be working on towards amending section 226. I know other countries have various sections, so that will be very important. Then also I need to mention around the law and the suicide deaths. Most of the suicide deaths are still treated as coming as a result of a suicidal attempt, and so they are considered, they are treated more in a criminal perspective. And that really adds up to the stigma, because the normal way people have their last respect, that is taken care of. And so it's also an area we need to look at when you look at the legal framework. So basically, that's a lot of work needs to be done around policies and legal framework. We'll be giving more details as we release our strategic suicide prevention strategy. Specific actions and targets we'll set with various actors to work on them, so that we can achieve our goal. Our goal is to reduce suicidal deaths by 10% by the end of our strategy, that is 2026. Let me come to the second area of policy, is around access to evidence-based services. And when I talk about access to evidence-based services, we are looking at all the services which the population require to address the issues of suicide behavior. These range from health promotion, preventive measures. When I talk about preventive measures, will be issues about risk reductions, but also looking at the various determinants of health and other protective aspects we may need to address. Then the issues of crisis interventions for people who are going through distress. Treatment, people can access evidence-based treatment, the follow-up care, and also taking care of the bereaved families. So these are key areas where the policy will be looking at. Our mental health policies and the implementing action plan is taking care of most of these areas, and they require quite a lot of investment from at the county level, at the community level, so that we can realize our goal of reducing suicide. Then the third area of policy is on the restriction of means. As I mentioned in the first bullet, the commonest means of suicide in this country has been found to be hanging from various reports, but also there is a lot of use of organophosphate, especially for suicidal attempt. And these keep on changing, with the change of the society. You may find very soon that firearms may become a big problem. We may find issues of other means like fall from height may also become a problem. So this is an area we're changing, and also we need to make all necessary policies to address the way we may reduce access to these means, so that for those people who may be having suicidal ideation or about to have plans to attempt suicide, it becomes very hard for them to access the means, and that delay or that deterrent provide an opportunity for them to access care. So that's the whole essence about restriction of means. You make it not as easy as possible, but then at the same time, you need to have an intervention happening within that time when you are able to reduce the access to the means. Then there's the issue of advocacy, education, and communication. Specifically here is to address the issue of stigma. Advocacy will be a key thing. We need to change the various sociocultural perspective about suicide, the legal barriers. And so one of our plan is to address the issues of advocacy so that we can look at all those barriers, whether they're sociocultural, whether they are legal, and also address the issues within our society, which are major determinants, especially issues of poverty, hopelessness, and a lot of pain, because people going through extreme pain, hopelessness increases their suicidal behavior. Education is very paramount, and here education and training is at the societal level, the gatekeepers, that they need to have the necessary education so that they can be able to become the people who advocate, they become the people who change. They're able to help us in the implementation of the policies, but then also the training of the healthcare workers, especially emergency workers, who most of the time come into contact with people with suicidal behavior. And some other studies have found that many people who attempted suicide or died of suicide, at one point they had come across healthcare workers, but maybe enough intervention was not given. Then the area of communication, especially here we are looking at the media. The media need to be trained on responsible media reporting, because the media they're quite influential within our society, and not only the traditional media, we are having now a very powerful social media. We need really also to have policies, strategies, and guidelines around training the media personnel on how to report on issues of suicide, to report in a way that is helping to eliminate or curtail the issues of suicide. And very important is that the issue of surveillance has been mentioned. We need to work within all agencies to ensure that we have the necessary data. This is the health facility level, at the community level, at the registration of births and deaths. We need to be able to have the necessary data and eventually have a registry on suicidal behavior within the country. So that will be very important, because we'll be able to keep a track on what are the risk factors, what are the patterns, what are regional differences, and then these will be able to inform our policy, but also inform us our intervention. And also the research will be very important to be able to, again, help us with the same. So basically, those are key areas of policy. There's a lot of work going on. As I mentioned, we'll be having the strategy coming out this year. And again, our action plan will be launched tomorrow. It will be a virtual launch for the Kenya Mental Health Action Plan 2021-2025. So all of you are invited. So thank you. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you, Dr. Njuguna. And we'll see if we can post some of that information about where people can participate tomorrow, if possible. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving along. So Dr. Boniface Chitayi, I'm going to turn to you. And as I've been doing with everybody else, I'll post your more fulsome bio in the chat, but I'll hand it over to you now for your comments on where we're going next, I think.
Thank you, Diana, and the organizers of this webinar, and all participants and fellow panelists. I'll first start by conveying a message of greetings from and apologies from Elizabeth Kamundia, whom I've been working with on the petition on on the decriminalization of suicide. She's the focal person for disability and an assistant director at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And so she wished she would have been here. So to just start off, while preparing for this webinar, I posted, I shared the post on Twitter, and one of the comments I got from one of my contacts on Twitter was this, and I'll read. So she said, suicide is the highest level of conscious control of one's life one can achieve. It is the epitome of courage, the absence of fear, deciding when and how you exit this world, deciding when and how you exit this world, not for the faint-hearted. So really, the reason why I'm reading that comment is basically to just demonstrate how varied the views on suicide are. Some are conservative, some emanate from religious beliefs, some from our cultural backgrounds, but again, some are quite liberal, philosophical, and at some point you can wonder whether some of the views could be a reaction formation whereby the behavior is directly perhaps being portrayed to address some of our fears about suicide. And the reason for that is because human beings have this innate drive for living. And therefore, it's understandable that a lot of people really get confused with the idea of suicide. And even in the clinical settings, it is quite an emotional issue when it comes to dealing with patients with suicide. So I'll just start us off with a research done in 2014 by Klonsky and May on who proposed a three-step theory of suicide. And there have been many theories about suicide, going back to a cognitive theory by Beck, interpersonal theory by Joyner, and many other theories about a psychodynamic theory. And of course, people go back in time to Durkheim, who proposed that suicide is a result of disturbed social forces. So in 2014, these two gentlemen did a study that looks compelling and proposed three steps that basically for someone to develop suicidal ideation, they first experience pain and a sense of hopelessness, that without pain and hopelessness, you will not develop suicidal ideation. And so if you have either pain and you have hope, you may not develop the ideation, or if you are hopeless but you have no pain, then you may also not develop. But if both exist, you may develop ideation. Then the next step is where the ideation grows from just a moderate ideation to strong ideation, and that's mediated by connectedness. So your sense of connectedness determines whether you are going on to develop strong ideation or they remain moderate. And so that becomes the next step, mediated by connectedness. And the third step separates the ideators and the attempters. So what makes somebody attempt suicide will depend on certain factors, or that all called capacity for suicide. So capacity for suicide could be dispositional, which has something to do with one's genetics. So we know that there are people who genetically are afraid of needles, they're afraid of blood, so those are dispositional factors that are inherited. And of course, one could even say that if in school, we grew up in a culture where we suffered corporal punishment. So if you're afraid of caning, probably that's some dispositional protection right there. And then there is the acquired, capacity for suicide. And this comes in with those who are exposed to pain, abuse. And so over time, there is that habituation. They are now used to the pain. And so this increases their risk. And that's why we talk about, people who have been in combat, first responders, the soldiers, and so on. And then lastly, of this capacity is the idea of practical ability for suicide. and that includes means, access to means, but also knowledge of the means. So, and that's why we talk about, again, if we talk about health workers, they have access to medication, and if we talk about police officers, they have access to firearms, and they know how to use. So they have the practical capacity for suicide. So basically, that then, if you have capacity, then you are likely to attempt, as opposed to the ideators. In Kenya, there have already been a mention of Article 226. So, however, there have been recommendations or documents within Kenya that will support decriminalization of suicide, and these include the Constitution, Article 43, that provides that every person has a right to the highest attainable standard of health, which includes mental health. And so if then we agree that suicide is as a result of mental health, then this article itself would in itself be a reason to outlaw suicide, to decriminalize suicide. The Kenya mental health policy, so itself, its vision, where it envisions a country where mental health is promoted, is valued, and mental disorders are prevented without stigma and discrimination, is another support. And the third is the Mental Health Task Force report, who, interestingly, a lot of colleagues who are present today were also part of. So recommended that Parliament should move fast to decriminalize suicide attempts in order to reduce stigma and discrimination, and also encourage for people to seek help. And so that's another point. And the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, already mentioned by Dr. Njuguna. And lastly, even the commemoration of Suicide Prevention Days on 10th of September every year, there are renewed calls every time that we should decriminalize suicide. So there have been a number, and of course, there's always room for improvement, but there have been a number of efforts and recommendations. So, but actual efforts that are currently going on, we have the first one, which I'm part of, is the Suicide Attempt Decriminalization Petition, which is a draft petition, which aims to draft a petition, present to the High Court, seeking that Section 226 of the Penal Code be declared unconstitutional. So that then will mean that no one will be punished for suicide attempt. There's also another effort through Parliament, the Parliamentary Caucus on SDGs and Business, which also seeks to amend all laws that are related to suicide. And we've been in some conversation with this team. And we've agreed that both routes have their merits and demerits, and we'll try both. And whichever succeeds first, we'll run with it. In India, for example, I think that decriminalization came through the review of the mental health laws. And so whichever route gets us there, we'll take it. There's also a committee working on criminal justice reforms in Kenya called the National Committee on Criminal Justice Reforms, NCCJR, which is looking at the whole criminal justice system, from arrest to trial process to correction. And so one of the areas that are also looking at is which laws relate to mental health that need to be decriminalized or declassified, so that persons who are who offend those laws are not taken to incarceration and so on. So it's also likely to make some review of the penal code itself, and that could be another opportunity where this can happen. So with the decrim itself, just going through a summary of what's happening. So the partners in this petition are the Kenya Psychiatric Association, which was formed in 1986 to promote the practice of psychiatry and also mental health in Kenya. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, which was established under Article 56 or 59 of the Constitution to promote and protect human rights and freedoms of all Kenyans. The Aga Khan University Brain and Mind Institute, who have convened us today, and the Mental Health Alliance of Kenya, which is an association of persons with lived experiences. The petitioner for this will be a person with lived experience. The objective is, of course, to have Section 226 of the Kenyan Penal Code declared unconstitutional. The process will include, and that we are already pursuing, includes convening, which has already happened, concept writing, which has already happened, drafting of the petition is ongoing, and presentation of this filing in the court, and there will be some reply to that filing. Then media engagements, case determination, and post-ruling. Of course, they could rule in our favor or they may not rule in our favor. But whatever happens then, if they don't rule in our favor, we could do an appeal. But if they rule in the favor of the petition, then also we may have to go ahead and do some post-ruling activities, which may include educating the public and the media so that they understand the meaning of that kind of ruling. And timeline, we hope that it will be by December 2021. And although some processes are beyond our own control because courts will set their own calendars. So in conclusion, suicidal behavior is primarily caused by mental disorders that are treatable, hence suicide itself is preventable. And so the offense of suicide under Section 226 of the Penal Code then is against the provisions of Article 43 of the Constitution. There's been numerous recommendations for decrim of suicide in Kenya, including the Mental Health Task Force. And currently, there are ongoing efforts to decriminalize suicide through both courts and parliament. And these efforts will require a broad base of support to succeed. And this should not be the only effort, since we've not really exhausted the number of efforts. And there have been many other efforts beyond this, including writing of articles and discussions in the media. But what I'd like to say last is that every discussion about suicide should, whether it's in the media, radio, TV, or articles written, should always be capped by including the need and making a call for the need to decriminalize suicide in Kenya. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Boniface. And I'd like to just take a moment to thank all of you for sort of listening and holding on to your questions. And you may have noticed we've been running a little bit long, but I've been letting the session go on because we're using today's webinar as a bit of a foundation for this discussion and an opening up of all the issues. And we can have additional sessions to go in detail into some of the specific questions and answers that all of you are interested in. So thanks for your sort of flexibility in that regard. What we'd like to do next, and Dr. Boniface, thank you very much for that overview of your strategic directions. And I think there are some questions probably emerging around what's the strategy, given the ministries mentioned a few moments ago that there is an intention there to change the law. But let's take the time now to hear from Ms. Charity Muturi and Mr. Victor Kamau, who we've invited both to give some perspectives at the webinar here. Charity first on lived experience. We'd like to invite Charity to comment a little bit on from the perspective of people who have lived experience with this issue. And after Charity gives her comments, I'll turn to Mr. Victor Kamau for some perspective from the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights. So Charity, can I turn to you first, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for this fantastic opportunity. I have lived experience with a mental health condition and also care for a family member with a mental health condition, but they prefer anonymity. I feel like suicidal thoughts and prevention always feel like there are two sides to a coin. There's always something for and against or different with different people. And suicidal ideation has been explained very well by our very able panelists. So allow me to introduce a different angle. I started having suicidal thoughts at 14. And when I was 16, a camp counselor made us repeat to ourselves severally, suicide is selfish and I am not selfish. And so I continued to say that to myself when I had suicidal thoughts. And slowly these thoughts stand from thoughts of sadness and worthlessness, cry for help, to what I felt was unselfish suicide for a cause. And just for example purposes, like the first ideation I had was to take a suicide note to KBC for them to read in the news that have sacrificed my life, for the president to take care of all street children. And I was 16 at the time. And in the last 26 years, I've made hundreds and hundreds of obsessive, altruistic suicide plans, which now I know are called altruistic suicide for a cause, though mostly it is related to suicide bombing. This form of suicidal ideation is very dependent on purpose and intention. So when I'm in that irrational frame, I feel very offended if someone says died by suicide, even if it is the right thing to say. And these thoughts ask, exciting and scary and bold, not scary. But when I share this, whether it's in groups or to professionals, I'm always questioned why I think of suicide like that. And it feels like I need to align my irrational thoughts to the majority instead of getting a system that can be responsive to my need. In 2018, I went through treatment by medication for the suicidal thoughts as part of my bipolar diagnosis. In 2019, I went through 6 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy, which was scary. It did help, but it also affected my memory. Last year, I finally met a suicide specialist who I felt understood me. They didn't sort of try to convince me not to die, because like I said, this form of suicide is driven by purpose and intention. They asked to postpone as we discuss a few issues, and that was more palatable for me. Madari was not admitting at the time because it was soon after COVID and I couldn't afford a private hospital. So I was hosted by a rehab through a favor by a friend. And surprisingly, it was very helpful to process this huge sense of change and loss that people did not understand, together with persons with addiction going through the same issue of processing loss and starting life again. And I really enjoyed the AA program, even if it's not necessarily meant for me. I care for a family member as well who experiences suicidal thoughts and ideation. Theirs also does not feel it fit in the usual description. I keep saying that there seems to be a box and we are octopuses with many tentacles. In 2015, the suicide plans for them and what they were talking about was at its worst. I was unemployed and broke and could not take them to a public facility because they had an irrational fear of the government. And in our mental health support groups, I see patients being so annoyed at family members years later for decisions like that. As after that admission, I did not feel relief as I expected. I was scared, confused. I had doubts as to whether we'd done the right thing. And many caregivers fall into depression due to this burden of care and lack of direction. Being a caregiver for me is harder than being a patient. We need psychosocial and economic support from health and social protection systems, both as patients and as caregivers. My father is a religious leader, extremely supportive, and during that year, he found a lot of emotional support by Reason to Hope and the PCA Mutero Church, because it was easier for him to process these issues with another religious leader. And we are really grateful that they supported us because we are not members of PCEA. Recently, he mentioned in a religious leader group as part of a story that I was at Madari, and he was shocked that he was immediately removed. And this is the reality that is around us that we cannot ignore. Similar paradoxes plague the decriminalization of suicide. When I learned I could go to prison due to a suicide attempt, I perceived that the government really cares for me, and I was very impressed. However, it also inspired me to plan bigger, sort of to combine different means to ensure if one doesn't work, then the other two do. And because I was more afraid of going to prison than death itself. And it is the writings of Professor Lukoye, Atwoli, and discussions with KNCHR that have slowly turned me from a decriminalization critic to a facilitator. Lived experience scenarios include being arrested, handcuffed, charged, slapped, put in a cell, taken to court, then taken to hospital or released back to the family. Sometimes police insist on families taking their person for psychiatric treatment. Sometimes it is families that request or bribe the police to teach their person a lesson, not to do this again, but not necessarily charge them with it. For patients, it worsens the psychological impact to be in a cell and also increases family conflict. And at the end of the day, this person goes back to the same environment, the same triggers of whatever had initiated the suicidal thoughts, whether it is poverty, gender-based violence, joblessness, relationship conflict, grief, death, terminal illness, or a capital offense or others. The root cause continues to exist in the midst of a new stigma of suicide or imprisonment. Caregiver scenario, I'll give an example of a lady who really supported her husband through mental illness, and but later he died by suicide. At the funeral, the pastor demonized the deceased for choosing hell in front of his children. Yet when he was alive, the wife requested the pastor for spiritual support for the husband while unwell. To date, she's still blamed for the death of her husband by her community. Her children are warned not to play with children of the cursed and demonic family. Some religious leaders during these funerals do not even go near the gravesite or perform burial rites, worsening the belief and taboo that this is a curse, it's witchcraft, it is evil. In the last few weeks, on behalf of the committee on the petition that Dr. Chitayi has mentioned, I had an informal, I've had an informal survey with several OPDs, OCSs, prison and probation officers. Some felt that, yes, while it is an illness, it should still have a legal consequence because they fear that suicide attempts would go up dramatically if decriminalized. Actually, one quoted that, hey, nyinyi mtafanya watu wajue in Nairobi waishe. Translated to, you people will make people, in this Nairobi kill themselves and complete themselves, for lack of a better way to translate. That though the law is there, many clients who have attempted suicide are actually not charged. They're just taken to hospital. And if they are charged, it is with a different crime. Majority of suicide records at the police are for completed suicides, not attempted. And if charged, they are given an non-custodial probation order. Prison officers and probation officers that I talked to, most of them did not have any or had minimal cases. Those that were more common were combined with murder, grievous harm, or aggravated assault, because people who've committed these crimes panic and look at suicide as a solution. But there were very few on suicide attempt alone. However, they feel that people knowing suicide attempts are a crime reduces the cases and are a deterrent. So they're asking, why not keep the law and promote a standard, effective early detection, intervention, and referral system within the criminal justice system, which they felt was a win-win. But like I said, this is an informal survey. A security officer mentioned that their greatest challenge is working with a gun while experiencing suicidal thoughts because they have a mental health condition, yet they fear the stigma and discrimination of reporting it at work and what the consequences would be. Another officer mentioned he lost a 7-year-old nephew to suicide in March, but he doesn't know how to intervene even in the family as an uncle. The High Court confirmed that many clients charged for murder or violent robbery attempt suicide, but mostly it goes unreported due to the existing capital case. At a level 4 hospital in Kiambu, they said they did not have records of suicide attempts for 5 years and above, yet they say clients are regularly brought by the police, and if a mental illness is confirmed, then they are not charged with a crime. Benchmarking and mental health programs with different countries or borrowing from private practice is helpful. Most mental health patient advocates use private services and with good intention suggest copy-pasting solutions in private health facilities, but understanding the way of thinking of the majority low-income patients is important. For example, Mathare Hospital received 20 psychologists last year. Sessions go for 500. Most private patients, see this as very reasonable compared to 3,000 to 5,000 out here. However, conversations that I've had with patients at Mathare, which is my facility of care, do not understand why it is cheaper to see a doctor than a counselor. And they are not seeing immediate change with the counselor, so they'd rather not pay for it. So those are the things that we need to understand when we are pushing for policies. We understand the people at the low income settlements and those accessing public health systems. Civil society sometimes copy-paste what the West is doing in proposals, despite our differences, and while not contributing to culturally appropriate models. We in mental health circles are very sure that suicide should be criminalized. It's one thing we all agree on. However, as long as this conversation remains with us, it becomes a mental health problem for special people. So I call upon every mental health champion to promote this conversation as saving lives instead of preventing deaths, because we are all wired to save lives, and to find allies outside the mental health circles where possible, turn the critics of religious leaders and police and politicians into champions. I call upon the Ministry of Health to ensure that the upcoming specialized mental health facilities are well resourced to handle unique suicidal things, unique suicidal needs, to start proactive standard outreach programs for persons at risk of suicide, including capital offenders, terminal illness, GBV, those hit by economic crisis, by COVID and otherwise, and to engage other stakeholders, including social protection, to meet the basic need behind the issue. Please adopt transmagnetic stimulation in ECT because it affects memory loss. And as we bridge the divide, I also call upon the global community to facilitate locally appropriate mental health solutions. Lastly, I appreciate the inclusion of persons with mental health conditions in this forum, in the National Suicide Prevention Committee, at the Madari Hospital, National Hospital, and thank you for heeding our clarion call that nothing for us without us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charity. I didn't mean to rush you along, because you're right in pointing out, and we agree with you, that your voice is one of the most important voices to hear here, and you're representing many people on this issue. So thanks very much. Without further pause, though, I'll turn to Victor Kamau, please. Over to you. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Diana. I hope you can hear me well, all of you. And good afternoon.
I can hear you well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to take so much time, because I think a lot of what I might have covered have been covered by different speakers. But I have to tell you a little bit of why we have decided on the petition as a commission. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights is a commission which is a national human rights institution, which is a constitutional commission established by Article 59 of the Constitution of Kenya 2010. Our mandate, our core mandate, is to protect and to promote human rights, promoting and protecting human rights in Kenya. And this includes, as our core function, obtaining appropriate redress for violations of human rights. Now, interacting with this particular issue of suicide or attempted suicide, it is very clear to us, and from the various studies that have been undertaken, including our own study on mental health, we are in no doubt at all that criminalizing attempted suicide, and especially penalizing it, is a breach of the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And I think we join much of the world in thinking that criminalization of attempted suicide is actually promulgated in our penal code, but it is a relic of the past. It is a relic of history. We received this law on the 12th of August, 1897 from Britain, along with all their laws. And Britain went ahead and actually decriminalized attempted suicide in 1961. So we've been left shackled by a thing that has been already rejected in its homeland and bedrock. Other countries that have also decriminalized are India, 2017, Ireland, 1993, Canada, 1972, Hong Kong, 1967, New Zealand, 1961, Finland, 1910, and Sweden, the oldest of them all, 1864. So you can see that it is something that many people have thought about. On the judicial front, the United States judiciaries have pondered as to whether or not there is legal justification to criminalize attempted suicide. But in general, it has, courts there have held that punishing somebody who clearly needs help and not punishment because he's suicidal is undesirable, and they have therefore held that to be their position. Perhaps the most vibrant judicial interaction with this matter can be discussed by reference to India. Now, India has had a history of questioning the constitutionality of the criminalization of suicide in the context of cases where the defendants have survived suicide attempts and was subsequently arraigned before the courts. Now, without going into too much in the interest of time, there have been three main cases, two of them by the Supreme Court, but one by the High Court. The one by the High Court held that, yes, criminalization of suicide is unconstitutional, and it said it goes against the right to life. And this is because the reasoning is that the right to life has a corollary of the right not to live. So that is a wider interpretation, and that's something that we leave to the courts because they can decide to do that. Now, there are more conservative interpretations, of course. The second case found that it is discriminatory and completely against equality before the law. And the Supreme Court said no to both cases and said, in one case, it said that the right to life is a right that includes the right to human dignity. And so therefore the extinguishing of a life is in itself unconstitutional. So you see there are conservative views also about the same thing. But in the definite and firm belief that it is not punishment that is needed, but compassion and help to draw those who attempt suicide, to draw them to other options. Now, the Commission has decided that we would rather go the petition way because there are two ongoing, as Dr. Chitayi said, there are two ongoing processes. One is a process that will culminate in the amendment of the bill of the law of Section 226 of the Penal Code, and that is for Parliament to do. The drawback with that is that it is unpredictable. We don't know when it will happen. there are vagaries of external environment of parliament, because parliament has other priorities, some political, some, well, let's say politicized, and others, they don't, maybe are not, wouldn't be informed properly about every particular aspect of this matter. One thing that happened, for example, in India, is that although the courts decided that criminalization of attempted suicide is not punishable, they distinguished between terrorists and drug traffickers on the one hand, who would be perhaps wanting to commit suicide because either they've been caught or they are doing suicide, self-suicide in belief of a cause. And then they wonder, the courts wondered, well, how would that be taken if a blanket protection is given to every single person who attempts suicide without considering the circumstances? And that is why in India now, there is actually a desire to repeal, but it is not yet repealed, Section 309 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes suicide. It has not been repealed, but the court has introduced what is called a rebuttable presumption of mental illness, so that if you can show, or that if it is not disapproved that you have a mental illness, then the presumption works for you and you are not going to be punished. So you can see courts are also able to talk much and interpret either conservatively or liberally. And in our country, we have seen that the courts, the human rights courts, have delivered for us very, very many times. The commission has been involved in cases over, let us say, even taboo subjects like surrogacy, over issues like children born out of wedlock and their rights. And even where there hasn't been a complete outlawing of the statutes handling those matters, the courts have been able to instruct regulation. They have been able to say, Attorney General, this has to be done to this law. So it can be a halfway house or it can be a full house. Now, our intention is to go for a petition basically saying that criminalizing suicide, of course, prevents proper mental health care. And we are saying every person with a mental illness is entitled, as of right, under Article 43 of the Constitution, to be given the most highest attainable standard of health. And I think we would all agree that includes treatment for suicidal tendencies. Again, we are saying the criminalization and penalization doesn't actually make it a deterrent. If a person who is attempting suicide is imprisoned, apparently to be taught a lesson that he will never forget, it is likely that next time he tries to kill himself, he will ensure that the attempt is so much better executed that he will only learn a lesson that he will never remember. So clearly we are saying that what needs to happen is that there needs to be a change of response by the law, by the penal code, and by parliament also. We are committed also to that parliamentary approach, but we think that the petition is likely to deliver faster, especially because we want to file under certificate of urgency. This is a problem that can't wait. And we fear that if we go the parliamentary way and exclude the petition option, the priorities right now, as you take judicial notice, are things like elections, BBI, and so on and so forth. And this is clearly at the back burner. So the commission decides to do a petition as a strategy to bring this matter to even a good discussion, to flag it out for a good discussion, and hopefully to get a repeal of Section 226, but also to inform any other process, to inform the process of parliamentary debate, to inform the process of parliamentary lobbying, to inform the process of parliamentary action. And I think that is what we aim at doing. And I will stop there. I hope that I will be able to send my talking notes properly later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. And yes, I received your very succinct notes, which we will share with all the participants after the webinar. So thank you for sending them along. And thank you for the really important work you're doing. I'd also like to say thanks to those of you in the chat who have just been so kind as to send a word or two about your enthusiasm for us continuing on a few moments longer. I have not been a very good moderator in curtailing anybody's comments because I feel this is so important, and I appreciate the endorsement of those of you that have sent it along saying that you're happy to have these speakers continue as well. So we're not obviously going to have a moderated dialogue, and instead I'm going to turn directly to Dr. Frank Njenga, who is the Presidential Advisor on Mental Health and the co-chair of the Mental Health Task Force. And Frank, if I could ask you to just share a few of your thoughts on how you see the work to advance mental health and well-being in Kenya, and your reflections on the webinar, the discussions so far.
I will say just three very quick things. The first one is that if our country was as united in this matter of decriminalizing suicide as it is on all the other things that we fight day and night about, this would be a most peaceful country in the world. I say that because Charity has made it very clear that this is an act of saving lives. It's not just a busybodies trying to become famous. This is an act that is mandated of all of us human beings. And I think the approach that Charity proposes of saving lives is what, in a sense, has brought all the key actors and players in this, what I think is a very important task. Professor Khan gave us a global perspective, which we will find very difficult to disagree with. Professor Atwoli, our leading academic, has brought the voice together with Linet Ongeri. And I think to our listeners from other jurisdictions, I think that if it was not obvious at the beginning, our country, Kenya, has very serious actors in this movement of suicide prevention. Dr. Njuguna, my friend and colleague, has made the position of government completely clear. I stand here to represent a government. And I would like to say that the position assumed by academia is the same position that is assumed by our government. And I can say confidently that the president is together with us in this move. Dr. Chitayi, I really like your enthusiasm and clarity of thought. And I think what you bring to the table is a unity and clarity of purpose of the entire profession. So don't look back. I think I can confirm to you, which you already know, that the entire professional colleagues are together with yourself. It's not lost to me that I think by the grace of God or just by chance, we have a new Chief Justice in the Republic of Kenya. And I would think that part of this panel and in your efforts, Dr. Chitayi, to get an early hearing date, it may not be bad for you to bring us together as your colleagues to pay what in Kenya we call a courtesy call to the Chief Justice. And she might just be able to give us an early hearing date. I'm encouraged in the extreme by the meetings that Dr. Njuguna and I have had with Parliament. Both houses of Parliament, the National Assembly and the Senate, have indicated that they are available to help us. What I like about the approach that we Kenyans are taking is that we are taking a multi-pronged approach to this. It doesn't matter who slays this dragon. All that we want is that we slay the dragon and save lives, as has been said. The last thing I would like to say in the interest of time is to thank the organizers and promoters of this webinar. It cannot be taken for granted, the efforts that you have put into place. You have enabled us, Kenyans and other interested parties, to participate effectively and fully in this matter that is of the greatest interest to all of us. Diana, nobody has thanked you yet, so I take this opportunity to thank you personally for all the efforts and coordinating activities that you have so diligently carried out. I thank you all, and that is all I have to say this evening. Many thanks to you all.
Thank you, Frank, so much. I think this is just the beginning of how the Brain and Mind Institute at Aga Khan can hopefully be helpful as a convener alongside many other convening organizations in Kenya and around the world. We've been requested already to have a similar discussion like this one in one of our other Aga Khan University countries, Pakistan. So I think you can anticipate that we'll be doing a little bit more to convene other conversations of this nature in other countries where issues are similar but distinct, no doubt. What I'd like to suggest now is that I turn to Zul Merali, my colleague at the Brain and Mind Institute, who can share a few of his thoughts. He's been very patiently standing by since we started, and he would like, no doubt, to share with you just a little bit of information about the new Brain and Mind Institute at Aga Khan University. And perhaps, Zul, you'd share just a word or two about where you see our work at the Institute proceeding on either the research front or the engagement front or events like this. Over to you, Zul.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you very much to all the panelists and participants. I think we have been, as articulated by Frank at the end, we have been very proud really to host this event and to host experts from the government of Kenya, from persons with lived experience, people with legal expertise, and academics alike, to kind of boil this conversation because I think it's a very important conversation that we're having. The role of the Brain and Mind Institute, which is a newly formulated institute at the Aga Khan University, is exactly that. Is part of it is to promote mental well-being, but also be a forum for advocacy and for helping people who suffer essentially in silence. So maybe if I can just take a few minutes and share a few slides with you I'd love to kind of tell you a little bit more about what the Institute is all about. And so, Diana, is this showing?
Yes, you'll just need to go into presentation mode.
Okay, doing that in a second. There we go. So the Brain and Mind Institute is a newly formulated institute, as I said. And in essence, as you can see from our logo, it signifies a lot about connections, not only connections within the brain and the circuits within the brain, but also connectivity with the community. And you see a little leaf on the side in the brain showing a growth mindset. In other words, we can change systems and we can change internal systems and our societies, which is the dialogue that we were having today. And the Institute is focused on 6 major platforms. It's going to be focusing on access to services and care, promoting awareness and prevention and promotion, promoting education, providing literacy, and very importantly, connecting with partners. So we talk about a connection not only from within the university, but also with our partners in the government, in the community, and in the private sector. And one of the components that we're going to be focusing very much on is the mental health systems strengthening approach. In other words, we want to be able to identify weaknesses in the service delivery mode and to use implementation science to bring the best possible solutions to help move things forward. And last but not least, we are a research institute and data is very important. Here, I'm just showing you a little bit of what I call the connectome within the university. So the purpose of the Brain and Mind Institute really is to kind of build upon the strength that's already there at the university. And you can see all the different institutes, colleges, schools, departments that can bring a lot of strength to the area. And the Brain and Mind Institute in the center, you can see, is focused on mental health and neuroscience. And as time goes on, we will be developing connections with neurological conditions, mind-body interactions. We're going to, of course, leverage technology and artificial intelligence and focus very much on the delivery science through innovation. What was brought up, and Dr. Dean Atwoli referred to this, we are in the process. By the way, the Dean is also the Associate Director of the Brain and Mind Institute. We work very closely together. And here you can see a bit of a roadmap of what we are trying to achieve as a framework that is going to be encompassing our activities at the Aga Khan University as a unifying roadmap. And you can see that we're going to be focusing on well population, at-risk population, people who are mildly ill, moderately ill, and severely ill that would require different levels of intervention and different roadmaps to get there. And so that is something that we're working on, and we will finalize it in the next few weeks. Finally, in terms of the research and data, we want to create benchmarks. There was a lot of commonality in the discussion that we had this morning, today's webinar. Everybody was calling for surveillance data, more concrete data, so that we can develop systems that make sense for us. We want to increase support for interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral research. We want to build local networks and global partnerships. We want to examine and improve existing data systems such as surveillance platforms and periodic surveys, and provide innovation and translation research actually to make a difference on the ground with newer practices that are culturally appropriate and sensitive. And of course, we want to promote discovery research for the future. So this, in a nutshell, is what the Institute is all about. We want to connect, strengthen, empower, mobilize, and advance innovation. So with that, I'll say thank you for being such patient participants in the webinar. And I also wanted to extend my special thank you to all the panelists, all the participants, and to Diana for having done such a fabulous job in moderating and setting up the webinar. So thank you all, and we'll see you in the near future on another event soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Zul. And also likewise from me, big thanks to everybody who's been participating today. I would like to add one more thanks to all those behind the scenes who have quietly been supporting us, Enzanazo, Esther, Ken, Laban, and others at Aga Khan University, and all of the others supporting each of you as you've been preparing for the events today. I think it goes without saying that this is an issue that we're going to see some remarkable movement on. Hopefully, that will be of great help to many, many people. And when I called everybody to ask if you'd be available to join the session, you all agreed readily. So stay tuned for more events like this one. Thank you for your comments and questions, which we will do our best to follow up on separately, not now as we've gone quite considerably over time, but we will do our best to circulate to you the links for the website where we will post the recording of this event. And some of you have asked for copies of the presentations, which we will confirm with the speakers that we can share with you. We'll follow up to do that. We will also let you know when we're going to have subsequent discussions. And so I'll just pause here long enough to see if there's anybody from amongst the group that has something that they'd like to say before we close down the Zoom session. Yes, Zul?
Yeah, just a final word. I wanted to say that we have just launched our website, which is sort of a prototype in progress work website. And we would love to get input from you to see whether it reflects what you would like to see in our website. And if you have any suggestions, please feel free to send comments to Nazo, who is our communications driver for this website. Thank you.
Super. Anyone else? All right. Well, look, it's been a terrific session. Thanks so very much. We'll talk to you all again before too long. Be well.